Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Paul Adepoju, and I'm the community manager for the ICFJ Pamela Howard Forum on Global Crisis Reporting. I always tell the story every time we start a new session like this. The initial goal of the forum started out as a response to the global COVID-19 pandemic. And we soon realized that there are several other crises elsewhere that are of global importance that journalists also need to be helped and guided in being able to report them. And one of the really effective ways through which we are able to achieve these set goals is also to engage with journalists that have already specialized in reporting this highly important issue. And by leveraging their experience and bringing them on board to share their personal journalism experience in reporting these issues, we are able to guide, inspire, and and I'm looking for another English word and lead others that are interested in embarking on this journey. And this is something that we are doing again today and on a very, very important topic. I'm really excited to be hosting this session because I've always been personally interested in knowing more about how journalists report that are really specialized in covering gun violence in different parts are able to do it. And even though this is an extensive topic that we do not expect to actually finish discussing today, I believe that we are going to have some progress on this issue. And if you're out there and you're trying to report on this topic, this would serve as a very, very important issue for you to focus on. Even if you are joining us from a country where gun violence is not being reported, we still believe that we can guide you today in knowing what to look out for in writing stories on gun violence. So, from The Guardian, I'm glad to be joined by Habin, who is a reporter in the Los Angeles office for The Guardian, and she's currently the lead reporter on the newspaper's Guns and Lies in America series. The series was launched in 2019 and it focuses on the impact of and solutions to community violence. Avini, how are you doing? And thank you for accepting our invitation today.
Yeah, of course. Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you very much for joining us today. And all our forum members, we are always happy to know where you are joining us from so that once in a while we can actually localize these conversations to suit some of you. So you can use the chat box option on the Zoom platform to let us know where you are joining us from. We are going to appreciate it. And if you are watching, yeah, we are streaming live on Facebook. So if you're also watching us live on Facebook platform via the different pages. I know we are on the IGNet page. We're also on the community forum page for the ICFJs for the forum. So wherever you are joining us from, use the chat box below the live stream video that you are watching to also engage with us and to also ask questions that may be pertinent to you or that you're just curious about. And yes, so with that aside, the first question I've always had on my mind that anybody that we are able to get to discuss this topic would be what really uh, what was the attraction for you towards covering gun violence? Because personally, I can still vividly remember the first time I heard a gunshot. I don't think I can ever
Mm.
be interested in even remotely thinking about uh, covering that topic. For you, what was the moment that you think this is something that I have to do and that you are really doing so well? So, what was the starting point for your gun violence reporting aspect of your
Yeah,
career?
absolutely. So I never planned on covering gun violence for this long. It's been about 3 years now. I'm from a city called Richmond, California, in the Bay Area. And growing up, I just knew that gun violence was a thing. At a certain age, you just start to hear about, young people. I was 12, they'd be maybe a couple years older, who were like being shot and killed. I was used to hearing gunshots. It wasn't really anything that was too alarming. I knew whether or not they were close to me. If you hear it down the street, it's not a worry. But if it's like, right where you're playing, okay, duck down. Thankfully, that never happened. But, I always knew that it affected the people that looked like me. In my mind, it affected the people that looked like me the most. So when I was in my early career of reporting, I was doing a lot of like city meetings and going to meetings about initiatives for like more fresh foods or some of these, community development efforts. And one of the things, whether they're talking about, like I said, some sort of community garden or improving a park, it would always come back to, this will do this, this, and this for the city. And maybe it'll help reduce some of the gun violence too. And the fact that all of these efforts tied back to this one thing was fascinating to me, but that also felt very normal. It's like, yeah, of course people want to prevent this. And once I started to see more into the wider news landscape, I started to see how much the conversation, one, either was only about the immediate homicide and not so much about all of the efforts that people were taking to make things better, how folks were supporting the families of the people who were killed. And on the other side of that, the national conversation was all about mass and school shootings, which are, of course, horrible and deserve a large amount of recognition and attention. But I was like, after we talk about a school shooting, the conversation on gun violence ends, but there are thousands and hundreds of thousands of Black and Latino, poor folks who are dealing with this every single day and don't get the same level of attention or reprieve. I did my thesis I went to Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism, and I did my thesis on how gunshot wound survivors and people who have lost their children to gun violence feel about criminal justice reform. And after that thesis project helped me get my job at The Guardian. At first, it was just a 9-month sort of experimental project on gun violence, and it has continued way past 9 months. So originally it was just me trying to like kind of set the record straight and infuse some truth about what my experience and what people like me experience when it comes to gun violence, and make that as central and as important a part of the conversation as what we see with school shootings and these high profile mass shootings in public places like grocery stores and movie theaters.
Yeah, thank you. And in preparation for this session, I've always been comparing, looking at publicly available information on the trend regarding gun violence, and it seems as if even though we hear of mass shootings every now and then, once in a while, there seems to be, from the data sets that I've actually personally reviewed, it's rare not to have a day that a gun violence doesn't happen. And but because not every gun violence makes it to the newspapers, is gaining attention. We tend to the public perception about gun violence could be that this is only happening once in a while, not as severe as it is. Even though the media has been covering it intensively, because I believe that because every life matters, and every person
Right.
that is a victim of gun violence is equally important. So, what can we say about this selection in the kinds of gun violence coverage, and how can we ensure that the coverage are still meaningful, even though it's something that is happening more frequently?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because if you did just watch national kind of mainstream American news, it would feel like the majority of the gun violence is these, very shocking incidents where about a dozen people are killed. And then you go a couple months without anything happening, and then a dozen more are killed. But that is not the case. People across the nation, if you look at, local news reports, especially in cities, it not to, of course, stereotype if there's anyone from Chicago here, but if you look at a local newspaper in Chicago, Baltimore, even where I'm from in the Bay Area, in Oakland, you will see that daily, weekly, people are being shot and killed in all sort of circumstances. I think when it comes to the U.S.'s to this perception that the U.S. mainly covers, these high profile mass shootings, is understandable. And there are a few reasons for that, I think. One is, when a everyday news consumer sees in the press that someone in a neighborhood that they would never go to, in a place that they have no familiarity with, don't care necessarily about the people, it could be where poor Black and brown folks are, they see a shooting happen there and they're like, oh my goodness. Well, they might not even say, oh my goodness. A lot of the times it's, well, that's what happens over there. Like, aren't these people used to shootings? This is something that they experience on a daily, so therefore it is normal and not as newsworthy, to a national audience. But when you have something like what we saw in Uvalde, Texas, in Buffalo, New York, the list goes on, Parkland, Florida, it's those things happen in places where, white middle class Americans can see themselves. They're like, I send my kid to school every day. I have to go to the mall. I go to the grocery store. I want to go out to a parade and enjoy it with my family. They can see themselves in those situations, and it's easier to empathize often because a lot of the victims, people are more able to say, well, they weren't doing anything. They were completely innocent and their life was taken by, someone who had nothing but ill intentions. Whereas if you, look at the people who I tend to cover, some of them might have had a criminal history. A lot of them live in low income neighborhoods. And there's this assumption that people in those communities are at best apathetic to what goes on and are just used to it as well, and at worst are actively complicit in what is happening to their communities. And that perception really stops people from caring, even if it's not, an ABC or New York Times headline. Elevating a local story about what has happened to somebody is incredibly, worthwhile. We just don't see it happen because people, that type of gun violence is just very in the background, is very, kind of white noise for a lot of Americans, because they just don't relate. They see it as something that, like, oh, well, that's their problem over there, and it's been going on forever, and they're able to push it to the side and not get activated the same way they do when it comes to a high profile mass shooting. And a lot of that has
Yes.
to do with race and class and, all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'll come back to the race and class
Yeah, of course.
discussion. And but for now, still looking at it from a general perspective, um, how do we, how do you ensure that um, the stories are still fresh? How do you still get fresh angles to a gun violence story that sometimes the general public that have been reading these stories over and over again may actually have an idea of what to expect and may be reluctant to actually pick it up. So how do you ensure fresh news stories, even though the topic has not changed for decades?
Yeah, well, another really good question. I think that when it comes to US news, especially US gun violence coverage, the stories of the people who, well, one thing is suicides are the majority of gun violence in the US. It's over about 50%. And then after that, we have what we call the community gun violence. And those are the instances that I refer to when I'm saying gun violence. More generally, I'm speaking about community violence specifically. So a lot of people, sorry, one second. Let me gather my thoughts here. I think that the stories about, poor Black and brown folks just haven't been told enough. So it's an area where I have found it's kind of always fresh and people are always surprised when I, get a first person account from somebody who, lost their son or daughter. And when it does come to new angles and keeping things fresh and keeping stories going, if there's like a mass shooting or something, there's always, an opportunity to talk about what a given community or what a nearby neighborhood has been dealing with in terms of daily gun violence, while a lot of reporters, and maybe even your main assignment desk or something is focused on the mass shooting, you as a reporter can go to neighboring communities or look at the state or county and be like, oh, okay, well, this is actually, where the majority of gun violence is concentrated, and these are the people who are trying to do something about it. That is always a smart story to do. And when it comes to me personally, I usually take something that's going on in local news, just I have a story coming out this coming Monday about the increase in highway shootings. That's something that people see sporadically, once, and you're just like, oh my gosh, that's another one where people are like, oh my goodness, I could have been there. And, it really captures that public imagination, but not often do we get to hear directly from the people who are affected and hear from law enforcement about why it's happening. And actually, they don't know why it's happening, So there are always opportunities to take something that has been in the news cycle every couple of months and kind of round it up and really analyze it, talk to the people involved. And that is something that I found to be a very successful way to keep things fresh and push them forward. And like I said, when you go to like a rally or you go to some kind of like, keep the peace in the streets type of event, you're always going to meet people. You're going to learn about, how are you able to get your money? You're doing this important work often without the support of law enforcement. So how are you getting your money? And you'll find out that people are funding themselves, trying to spend and raise, thousands of dollars with no sort of reimbursement from the government, even though you're doing things to help citizens, is something that we see often. And it's been a real struggle for a lot of folks, but that's something that you wouldn't necessarily know or maybe think of as a part of American gun violence, but it's incredibly important. The people who, well, I'll stop there. Actually, I'm sure you're gonna ask some more questions. We're only like 15 minutes in, so I don't want to like just keep going. But yeah, I think that the stories about victims are always going to be fresh, especially if it's tied to an accountability story about counties and states not doing right by their victims of violent crime.
Yes, I like what you said about the victim, putting the focus on victims. No longer,
Yeah.
I think the coverage ought to have gone beyond just mentioning numbers, because it seems as if the numbers don't make much impact on the general public again, but focusing on
No.
victims. Before we go to some of your stories, that I think I would like you to explain how the editorial process. Let's talk quickly about the Guns and Lies in America project. Um, were you aware of how it came together, and what are you peculiarly doing through this project that probably could inspire other other editorial teams to also do something similar in their news organizations in different parts of the world?
Yeah. So my colleague Lois Beckett is a senior reporter for The Guardian, and she'd been there for maybe 3 or so years before I came on, maybe two. But she saw, I think, a similar phenomenon happening where there was this very intense focus on mass shootings that was overshadowing the daily gun violence that people experience. And she was able to apply for and get a grant from the California Wellness Foundation, and to run this 9-month series where we just focus on those stories of gun violence that are overlooked. So they hired me because, I didn't have much experience. I was still in school when they hired me, but there's something about knowing what the point is and knowing that we need to talk about community gun violence and all of the people that are overlooked for all of these very racist reasons, and put their experiences of gun violence in the center of this conversation. And that was always my goal and intention. And I think the Guardian respected that. That was something they weren't, what I'm saying, doing exactly until I came on, or at least not doing in a constant and consistent way. Maybe there was a story from a freelancer here and there about like this horrible thing that happened in Chicago, this very kind of trauma porn bad practice situation. So they brought me on to be a kind of full-time community violence reporter. It was very it was pretty local, actually, based in the Bay Area, which was an advantage to me, knowing the gun violence advocates and knowing the survivors out here was something that just came as a part of being a community member and, in my early local reporting days. So they hired me in 2019, and in that time, Lois, my colleague, she started to transition into more like domestic terrorism and things of that nature. So I ended up taking on this gun violence beat full time, and in the project, I do a lot of like if there's my specialties have become pretty much like community violence and ghost guns. Actually, these, I don't know if everyone is familiar, but they're privately made. Their proper name is privately made firearms. You can order one offline, and it's usually a few $100s. It can get steep, but you can order one with no background check to anywhere pretty much in the nation, though that is changing a little bit, and construct a gun, and they're a huge nuisance for police. They didn't even start counting them until recently, so it's hard to see a headline that's like the number of ghost guns found in Oakland explodes 150%. It's like, well, if they just started counting them last year, then of course it's going to look like it went from 1 to 1600. So that's my own personal aside and like beef with some of the stories, like you mentioned, that focus on the numbers but don't tell the entire story. So ghost guns and community violence is mainly what I focus on, and it's a lot of like longer stories, more enterprise, that require a couple weeks of reporting and a couple weeks of writing, and it's usually about a specific topic and victims within that. So to speak right now, I mentioned the highway shooting story, talked to a couple of victims' families. We're also running a series on the increase of homicides among Black women in the U.S. So that's a topic where you can talk to many victims, talk to many, public officials about that one. I've done one on how gun violence specifically is affecting the nation's teenagers, did a long story on that. And then a few months later, a study came out. Well, it wasn't even a study, it was from the CDC, the US Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And it was about how gun violence has overtaken car accidents as the number one killer of the nation's kids and teens. So in those type of situations, I'll write a daily news story, but usually I don't so much. And it's a lot of like longer term, in-depth, situations, unless there is something very pertinent going on in the news cycle where it's like, okay, do a quick feature on this, usually. But yeah, like I said, I really have the privilege of time and get to like dig in, talk to as many people as possible. If I haven't found the right person yet, I get a little more time, so it's a really interesting beat to be on. And I feel like whenever I tell people, they always are just like, you cover gun violence, but I've only covered maybe 1 or 2 mass shootings. I've only been to they do, if something huge happens, they don't usually send me, but I'll go if I have to. But they have a national breaking news team and like international reporters that they'll send to that kind of stuff, so I can focus on what's going on locally in those independent, individual stories.
Yeah, I'll come back to the process of what happens
Yeah.
uh, when there is a news of another mass shooting. But I'm really interested in
Mm.
probably letting our audience have an idea of the kinds of stories that you write and the kinds of issues that are really of importance to you. So we have this is I believe is a page on the Guardian, and obviously, like you mentioned, the issue of race inequality as they affect gun violence are really really important. So I wanted to take a look and just pick any of the story that you think you can take us through the process from the how the idea came around and how it was eventually published. So which one should I choose?
Let's see. I mean, we ran this series of Q&As. Here we're in the April 2022 section. The last 3 of them are Q&As that I really liked, but I'm gonna
Okay.
let you pick the show panel.
So which one should I click? We have
Can you scroll down a little more? There's one on like the politicization of victim stories. It might be on the next page. Their loved one was killed, and then their grief was politicized is the headline. And it might be, like I said, a little farther down or on the next situation. And it might be this January 2020. No, it'll probably be on the next page.
There's the second page, January 2022.
Yeah, they're a little farther down. Sorry.
It's okay. Should I go to the next page?
The page after that. No, we should. No, it was last summer, so you might actually have to go to the next page. Sorry. I be writing.
Oh yeah, you've done a lot.
Okay, there it is. The first one in July 2021. They lost loved ones to gun violence, and their grief was politicized. Right here on the top left. On my screen, it's on the top left. It might be. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, take us through it.
Yep, that is. And that was a story that was done relatively quickly and like a kind of. Well, I mean, it was like a month after one of the shootings had happened that I was talking about, but it was more pegged to the news than a lot of the stories that I end up doing.
Okay. So what's the story? What drew you to focusing on this on the particular angle that you chose?
Yeah. So in the U.S., there was a lot of, mainly in the summer of 2020, a lot of gun violence started to increase. It was early in the pandemic, and that's when shootings started to increase, but they really got kind of out of control and at these levels not seen in many years, especially in Oakland and Los Angeles in the summertime. And that continued on the next year. So I had seen a story about a young man who was shot and killed in Los Angeles, and his father is a what's called a cop watcher. Pretty much, he goes and films interactions with police. He films what they're doing. He, if they have tents that a lot of, it's not funny, but a lot of police officers have very tinted windows on their cars. And that's something that Black people are notorious for getting pulled over for, right? And as we know, getting pulled over, a traffic stop can turn deadly with a lot of, these police out here. So he goes and does a lot of accountability work with police officers. He's known for that. So when his son was shot and killed, there was a headline by a local news station that said, and I'm paraphrasing here, something to the lines of harsh critic of police now relying on police to solve son's murder. And the implication was, since this man is on the case, is on a lot of officers' cases, making sure that their traffic stops aren't getting violent, to make sure that they're not harassing people on the street. And if they are, filing complaints about it, really talking to an officer in his face. The implication was that he now is that it was like ironic or something, then now he needed the police help. When in reality, if someone is shot and killed, it don't matter if they were the greatest critic, if they came, to the police station every day and egged the windows. If someone is murdered, it is your job to do something about it and to help and support that family, So seeing that was just horrible. And then, not too long after, there's a holiday called Juneteenth here in the U.S. It's the celebration of, the last enslaved Africans finding out that they were free. The Union soldiers came to Galveston, Texas, and were like, "Hey, y'all are kind of, good to go." So there was a big celebration in Oakland, and families. It's a beautiful time, beautiful day. There ended up actually being a mass shooting, unfortunately, and this young man was killed. And the news was less. There was a little bit about, of course, the victim, what his family had to say, but then a lot of the coverage focused on what does this say about efforts to defund the police, which I thought was an interesting way to, an interesting and very politicized way to go about this conversation after this 19-year-old was shot and killed in front of a bunch of kids, and it wasn't even covered as like a mass shooting in the high profile. But the conversation quickly became, well, this is why we need more police, and this is what you Black people get for wanting police out of your communities, was the sentiment. So seeing these two stories coupled with the constant stream of, officials and right-wing news saying that gun violence and what's happening to Black and brown people is because they have Democratic leadership, because they don't trust the police. Pretty much a lot of victim blaming was going on. It was, Fox News fodders like, this person was killed, and this is an example of how this policy that was aimed at equity, there's a law called Prop 47 I mentioned earlier. My thesis was on how people who have been impacted by gun violence are feeling about criminal justice reform. So some of these reforms that were meant to make right a lot of injustices where mainly Black and brown people were in prison for decades, were being pointed to as the reason that now a lot of Black and brown people were being shot and killed. And that just wasn't the truth, based on what I know from community members, based on what I know from how gun violence works, talking to researchers. I just knew that that wasn't right. So I was able to get in touch with the man. His name's William Good. He's, I think he goes by Film the Police LA on Twitter, if you're interested in looking at some of the stuff he does. And I got in touch with him, and I got in touch with the aunt of the young man who was killed. And funny enough, she lived in the apartment complex that was right, across the street from my home, and was from Richmond and had a really deep insights on gun violence. So I interviewed them about how they felt about the news coverage surrounding their loved one's death, and they were horrified. They were talking about how it is compounding the trauma of already losing somebody so close to you, so violently and so publicly. So that is how this story came about. And that's something that I like to do. If there is something in the news cycle that's just kind of going unchecked, this narrative that's just being reported on, and then the perception around that narrative is being reported on, and then what somebody has to say about that is being reported on, but never the actual root cause and how the people who are at the center of that are feeling about it, that gets left out. And that is something that I like to try to do. So I think this is one of the best examples of that. And it came out a month or so after I mentioned the young man was killed on Juneteenth, which is June 19th, but I still feel like, it was pretty of the time. And we still see that kind of politicization. When people want to enact stricter gun laws, or what people call common sense gun policy, background checks and waiting periods, things of that nature, you'll hear usually a Republican politician come out and say well, y'all are so worried about, Second Amendment law-abiding people, you need to worry about what's going on in Chicago. And it's well, you're not worrying about what's going on in Chicago. So why are you trying to tell us, what we need to do, as if people who want stricter gun laws don't understand that? Well, it's pretty much a way of saying it's not the guns, it's the lawlessness, it's the lack of values and all of these other sorts of things. It's a deflection. So I try to right the ship as often as I can in my little, bubble with my little 3 years of knowledge here. 3 years plus a life, but 3 years of professional experience doing this. And like I said, that was one of my favorite, is a difficult word to use when you're a gun violence reporter, because if it's my favorite story, it means someone died and their loved one told me about it. But it is one of my favorite stories to this day.
Yeah, thank you very much. Which brings me to the next question, which is polarization of the subjects, especially in the media. And this is not just about politicians or political groups, but we also see these kinds of divisions even within the news industry. There are news channels that have different sets of values and different perspectives regarding coverage of gun violence. So, irrespective of what a news organization is dealing with, how do you think journalists that are covering this issue, that are interested in this issue, but are afraid of sacrificing their journalistic independence status because of the polarization nature of this subject, how do you think they can strike a balance, irrespective of which news outlet they are working for?
Well, that's interesting because I feel like a lot of the times balance and objectivity and these type of words are used to stop journalists like myself from covering a topic like this with those, racial and currently kind of gender intersections. You know, if I talk about what happened to a gunshot wound survivor, it is, like clockwork that someone will reach out and call me a lefty snowflake who, wants to take people's guns and isn't talking about the criminals and da da da. Like it's gonna happen. And I can't let that stop me from telling stories that I know are important and that I have gotten, feedback from family members and from organizers and from officials about the importance of this work and putting these stories at the forefront. So, I mean, if you're covering gun violence and you are concerned about, being kind of a part of the circus that is this conversation sometimes, I mean, as long as you have your data points right, you make sure your information and your numbers are coming from in the US, data on homicides is pretty lacking. But if it comes from an official place, you've checked it, double checked it, have talked to your criminologists and law enforcement and have done all those sort of basic things, then you have the building blocks of a pretty infallible story. And then once you add on, and that's usually fine, but once you add on those perspectives of like family members and people who want things to change, I find that that's more when the polarization comes up. And it honestly, a lot of the times it is unavoidable, but that doesn't mean it's not worth doing. And if you have an editor or something and you bring them a story about like, hey, there's this community, rural gun violence is something that isn't covered often in places, like rural Missouri and Kentucky, where it's suicides and community gun violence is happening, and tell them to people talk about it. So if you want to come to your editor and let them know, like, hey, there's this story, there's a group of people who are trying to address poverty so they can address gun violence in this place, and your editor says, I don't know, that might come off a little like biased, then that is a moment that, you might want to I don't know. You might want to talk to your editor about the larger reasons why talking about the connection between poverty and violence is important. That's something that people don't mention often. Like I said, often it comes back to criminality or personal will when it comes to gun violence rather than the systemic things that have been at play for decades in the communities where it's concentrated. So I think if you're always approaching it from like, what do these instances of gun violence tell us about larger things in the US, whether it's like, if you're talking about domestic violence or something, if there's a gun in the home and you're already in an abusive relationship, your risk of death is that much higher. And it's unfortunate that there are so many, women, men, kids, etc., who are trying to get restraining orders, trying to get protective orders, trying to use their their state's red flag laws, which is a policy that if someone has a domestic violence restraining order or something, then a sheriff or the officials can come and that person is not allowed to have a gun. They're legally barred from having one, whether or not they're in a state where it's permitless carry or what have you. But often those laws are just not enforced. So you see a lot of women and families dying, but that is often not a part of that gun violence conversation. So if you can look at something like what I just mentioned and go to the courts or go to a county where these things are continually happening and try to find out where those fault lines are, and try to find out where like who is missing this paperwork. Is it a judge who's deciding, I'm not gonna mandate that a sheriff go pick this gun up? Is it the local police that just aren't taking these things seriously? Like there's always an accountability angle in these instances of gun violence, and most editors will appreciate that. Maybe if you come to somebody and it's like, I just want to talk to gun violence survivors, they might look at you a little bit like, not sold. But if you can bring in the fact that like most guns in like California are trafficked in, you know, and look at some of the bordering states gun laws and connect them to, you know, it might be hard to connect it to an instance of gun violence, but you can certainly talk to your local and this is a lot of kind of US based jargon and organizations and government bodies, but whatever your nation's kind of official body on firearms, explosives, weapons, they're supposed to keep track of these sort of things and find out where they're coming from. And if you can find out that one, they're not keeping track and finding out things, or two, there's this huge increase, you know, in the number of guns being found from out of state and from these places, then that's something that you can go in with. And it is going to be polarizing regardless. Any story that you do on it, there are going to be people who say like you're only doing this to, you know, support the gun lobby. I don't think I'd ever be accused of that, but either people say that, or you are trying to sway the world against gun owners and create a world where it's impossible for quote unquote law-abiding citizens to bear arms and protect their families. It's inevitable, but that shouldn't stop you from doing these stories, is pretty much what I've been trying to say for the last 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much. And talking of those that are journalists that are just interested in starting a career in gun violence reporting, um, what I know the subject has been extensively reported, but personally, what do you think is still underreported? And for our audience, we have from this August, this is the first webinar we are hosting in August. Throughout the month, we are starting a mini story contest such that if you are reporting a story on any of the subjects that we are discussing during the month, and you publish a story, if you just share that story with us, you are qualified for a cash award. So it's very simple. So our guest today, what do you still think is still extensively underreported in gun violence, and where would you like those that are interested in covering this issue to start focusing on?
Are you talking about in the US specifically or like internationally?
Both the US and internationally.
Okay. So in the US, I am really curious, and it's always woefully underreported because it's ethically kind of difficult to do. And it's about suicide, you know, what goes on with people who decide that they want to end their life. And if you use a firearm, you're more likely to be successful, unfortunately. And it's something that, unlike the community violence that I focus on, is not in, you know, the people who are most affected by suicides or who are, you know, committing them are often middle-aged to older white men in these rural places. You know, just for a quick example, I'm looking at Iowa for a story on violence against Black women, and there might be, you know, 300 or so gun deaths in a year, and 227 are suicides, you know, and that's just something that I've never seen before. It's something that I'm not um, quite used to covering gun violence in California. But those dynamics I think are fascinating. The kind of gaps in mental health care or whatever is behind that is something that I find really interesting, and how it leaves families devastated and with a lot of questions is something that of course has parallels to gun violence, to the gun violence I cover, you know, community violence, but it's so different, you know, and the scars that it leaves are so different. And it's something that if there is like maybe I think that's something that a health reporter would be really well suited for, that can take the story past like all these people killing themselves to like what are the deeper issues, what are some common themes, what are the numbers and the trends saying. You know, there are some preliminary figures now that are showing that, you know, there's been a really steep increase in homicides among Black and Latino teens. You know, we know that mental health, that young people's mental health really suffered in the pandemic in ways that I don't know have been fully acknowledged, reckoned with, or repaired. And I think it's reflective in the way that suicide numbers have been kind of changing, you know, the kind of the level where white men who we think of as being the most at risk for suicide has remained pretty steady, but we're seeing these jumps among specifically like young Black girls. And it's something that has been covered more so in academic circles and less so in the news media, because there's this fear and concern that, you know, if you cover us, I don't know that the US news media has learned how to do this right yet, I'm not gonna lie, but there's this fear that if you say somebody committed suicide, that other people will then do it as well. And there will be a you know, an effect where somebody sees that this has happened, or you know, talk about the details of it, and who knows what that could trigger in somebody. So I think instead of wrestling with the topic, a lot of US news media has decided to ignore it in some ways until, you know, maybe there's a high profile suicide and it's like, oh, I have to cover this and I don't know if we're doing it right, you know, trying to kind of build the plane as we fly it. So I think if there's a US based health reporter, mental health, somebody with a who's really interested in mental health, I think it would be great to cover suicides and suicide attempts with firearms specifically. I always think that the way the US, a lot of US cities, states, and counties fail people who are dealing with domestic violence is something that's always worth talking about. A lot of the times, you know, in these places where people advocate for so many guns, if you look at the number of, you know, oftentimes, unfortunately, it is like women and kids who are being killed in these lethal situations. And then, you know, unfortunately, the male partner may kill themselves after in these kind of murder suicide incidents. I don't know that the lackadaisical nature that people approach red flag laws is taken seriously. There are so many situations where a woman has been documenting abuse, right? Has been trying to talk to advocates, has tried to go to a friend's house, has done everything they could, and yet and still this person is able to get to them and get a gun, you know, is able to get a gun, get to them, and then kill them. And every time you hear lawmakers and officials in these cities and counties just say like, well, this person is evil and we don't have space for evil. But like, you can't legislate and make laws around evil. And evil is just, I feel like a deflection to talk about failures in gun laws and failures to really try to heal people who are the abusers themselves. You know, you have to have these, if someone's in a court mandated course, you know, make it something rich for them that can really change the way they deal and interact with their families, you know. So I'd be really interested in kind of the systems that people who deal with domestic violence have to interact with, and how those systems may be failing or have some shortcomings, you know what I'm saying? Because in every system, there's someone who's trying to make it, you know, the best they can. But how there are these shortcomings that add risk of lethality for a lot of women. And then on the international front, I am always really curious about, like, if it's not guns that are leading to the most homicides, then like, what is it? Like, what is some other nation or country's kind of version of gun violence? It's like, oh yeah, all the kids are really struggling with, like, I've heard here and there about knifings in the UK, you know what I'm saying? And how there are kind of perhaps similar trends to US gun violence. Like, yeah, it's concentrated in some of these kind of poor neighborhoods, it's among the Black folks, it's this and that. And I would love to learn more about that. And I'm also really curious, you know, rap music is global, you know what I'm saying? Trap music, all of these things are global. And a big part of a lot of that is gun culture. You know, there's US gun culture, and within the different kind of races and communities here in the US, there's niche gun culture. And I wonder how, you know, when rap artists talk about their experience of gun violence, how is that received by other nations? Like, is it supposed to be fun? Like, you know what I'm saying? It's always something that I'm curious about, is like, are kids in places that, you know, you might not even have access to a firearm, are they then kind of acting out the gangsterness, quote unquote, that they see in television or in films or in music videos that is authentic to some people in these communities, but maybe, I mean, in the communities in the US, but maybe not be something that someone in like Italy or something is dealing with. But like, how are they receiving music that has more violent references? Is there like a moral panic in these places? Like, I'm always just really curious about yeah, how other people receive and localize these kind of Western images. And then I really want to know if there is a place where, like, gun violence is really increasing at that community level, or even at like a political level. There was the story about Shinzo Abe, and he was killed with, I was like, my boyfriend told me about the story, and I was like, oh, it was a homemade gun. Was it a ghost gun? And no, it was like some PVC tubing that he was able to get like 3 shots off. And I found that really interesting and sad, like how are people who want to commit an act of violence and specifically want that firearm, they don't want to get up close to the person, they want to be able to handle their business and keep it moving. Like, how are people finding these workarounds in places where guns are incredibly difficult to get? Like, I just have a lot of questions for how gun violence in the US is, localized, and where is gun violence going up? Are people building guns all over the place? Like, I don't know. So I have definitely a lot of questions there.
Yeah, these are several suggestions and insights. So please, if you're interested in these mini story contests, those are really, really valid and really, really impressive story ideas that she just share with you.
Yes, take them and
Yes.
go, please.
Yeah, please do. We'll find a way to package these ideas and
Yeah.
also reach out to others. So thank you very much. And as we go to the last couple of minutes, there is something I also want you to share, resources that could access to resources that you have been using, those that you can share that I think journalists that are interested in covering this topic can also check out to
Yeah.
support what you're doing. Yeah.
And do you mean resources that I use to like report, or what do you mean there?
Yeah, resources that I think would be relevant for
Okay.
journalists that are covering it. Anyone that you can share with us?
Yeah, I mean, I think for people who are outside of the US and just looking to kind of get into understanding, gun violence and the nature of gun violence here, there are a few national organizations that have pretty solid statistics, or if you reach out to their like media relations people, can connect you to community violence survivors, mass shooting survivors, and things of that nature. And those are groups that I learned about kind of after, because I was working locally, but they are incredibly helpful resources, especially if you are on a deadline and don't have time to like reach out to the one gun violence survivor that has the perfect insights. So one of them is called the Hobby, and that's the acronym for the Alliance for Hospital-Based Violence Prevention, and they focus on helping, states and cities develop programs within their hospitals that way, when somebody is shot or stabbed or has any sort of kind of violent encounter, they dispatch people to their hospital-based violence intervention programs, where people who are known in the community, who are trusted in the community and are trying to stop the violence, will show up to a hospital after a shooting to diffuse tensions, try to stop any retaliation, and then they'll go usually to the bedside of the person if they survive, and offer resources and let them know, or even just offer to pay for physical therapy, things of that nature. People become newly disabled after being shot all the time. So these hospital-based violence intervention programs try to make sure that the folks who are injured in these community violence shootings have access to resources and are able to live as full a life as possible, free of violence. And I think the Hobby is one of those groups that, like, getting in touch with folks there will help you kind of get oriented in what's going on. Another group is called the Community Justice Action Fund, CJAF, and they work, they do a lot of like kind of national lobbying to get federal dollars to gun violence intervention groups that work in hoods across America. And they also like work to build the capacity among gun violence prevention. There are a lot of gun violence prevention groups that are very mom and pop, just doing what they can locally, who may not be familiar with or may not know how to navigate being a part of like a local coalition of gun violence prevention groups. So this organization will kind of help folks organize around that, and bring people together and help train them and help them learn how to get some of the public dollars that I mentioned earlier. And I think the final group that would well, I'm going to say two. There's one group that I know would definitely help more with community violence. It's called the Live Free camp. It's called Live Free, and it is another. They do a lot of similar things to the group that I mentioned before, but they're more local, a little younger, and they do a lot there. And then I would say on a national level, I would say if you want to look at mass shootings, and this group has a pretty good has a pretty okay history on community violence. It's called Giffords. That's one of the most well-known ones. Usually after a mass shooting, you'll see an attorney or an advocate from that group, go on CNN, MSNBC, that sort of thing. So the three that I mentioned before maybe aren't featured as much in mainstream American news because they don't always just focus on the mass shootings. They really focus on this community violence and the kind of daily struggles people go through, but are excellent resources and have great people to talk to. And they love to teach folks who don't know much about what's going on in these streets. And then Giffords is one of those kind of reliable, I'm on deadline and need an expert type of places, but they do have a pretty growing and robust community violence prevention wing. So I would try those four groups. And then in terms of data, I mean, data in the US is tough because it's always a year behind. So right now, in the fall, the FBI releases data, crime data, homicide data, and often it's kind of lacking, honestly. There are some cities, states, and counties that just don't report their numbers. And so, when you look at that, you have to kind of take it with a grain of salt and not just report that number, but report the experiences that go along with it. But I would say if you go to the FBI, they have a table called, it's like a SHR, supplemental homicide reports, and they'll have those going back for decades starting in 2020. And then what I have found and have been using more often is the U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention's. They have a site called WISCARS. It's an acronym, and it's WISQARS. And that'll give you a lot of really helpful data in a more manageable kind of format. And somewhere also on the CDC website, I like to look at, they have a thing called like a vital signs report, and that'll tell you like the leading causes of death for Americans broken down by age and race. And that's where you'll often see, and that's where a lot of people got the figure that gun violence is the number one leading cause of children. I think that's what, right here, leading causes of death and injury. Yep, this is a really great resource. It comes out after FBI data, so it's kind of tough because whenever FBI data comes out, there's huge news. There's always a news flurry around it and analysis and all these different sort of things when that data is not that good. But when the CDC data comes out, it usually goes a little under the radar unless it's something shocking, like in this, most recent release of data, the increase in, guns overtaking cars for the deaths of children and teens. So that was something shocking. So the CDC data got reported on, but it's helpful as all get out to know how to get these things. And then of course, sometimes the local police department, I would pick maybe a local police department or a county, like if their sheriff or something has a newsletter. Sometimes, different agencies will just release their numbers, as a part of their kind of just a part of their public safety practice. They'll send out a newsletter or some sort of press release every once in a while to reporters that'll say, okay, this month or this year we had, there was 13 shootings, 10 of them were fatal. It's up about from 8 the year before. It's down from 15 the year before. So it's always good to stay up on those things. I would, if you're based in the US, I would pick where you live locally. I think that so often reporters in the US want to jump straight to like Chicago, Philadelphia, Oakland, and these places that have become unfortunately synonymous with the community gun violence I've been speaking of. But there's so much happening in so many places that don't have the same dynamics necessarily as Chicago, but are interesting and can tell us a lot about deeper systemic things in America that need to be addressed. So I would sign up for where you are locally to get those kind of updates if you're in the US. And if you're on, and if you're more international, you can pick some of those, I would say pick some of those bigger places to get acquainted with the areas, and then try to dig into like individual cities and counties that you may see sporadically in local news. Or another idea is to I have a Google alert for ghost guns. I would set a Google alert for like shootings in Denver or something, you know what I'm saying? Set a Google alert for shootings in Louisiana. The American South has a lot of gun violence. So I would actually write Google alerts is something I've been doing more often lately, and it's actually been incredibly helpful. So I think that might be a better way to go about things before you start signing up for newsletters and you hit like a flurry of emails about like bake sales that you didn't ask for.
Yeah, I'll let you catch your breath for once, 2 seconds. I think I really like this suggestion on Google Alerts, and I think it's better
Yeah.
if you're on this call and you don't know how to set it up. The first thing, the
Yeah.
easiest thing for you to do is just Google search for Google Alerts. So when you search for Google Alert, this comes up. So usually the first option, you click it, and so you create alert about something. I actually have just one alert for myself in case somebody is mentioning me any.
Yes. Well, you gotta
Yeah.
know. I
Yeah.
love that.
Now, so considering what she said, if you're trying to set an alert for ghost guns, you just type it, ghost
Mm-hmm.
guns, and you create alert about
Yeah.
it. Once you create alert, anytime there's something, there's a subject, there's a publication or something on a major stuff on the internet, um, that has that, it automatically comes to you. And it's something that works in the email. For instance, as you saw the way I clicked it, I don't know if you can see it. Google sent this. Oh no, it's not clear. There is a notification that comes to your email address. Let me see. Oh, it's not clear. Come on, it's not clear. No, yeah, okay. So an email comes in. Anytime there is a subject on that, there is an update on that, it comes in already. I have to an email talking about ghost guns already. So that is how you set Google Alert for ghost guns or any other topic, anything that is of interest to you. And sometimes you can actually still localize it and mention your city where you are, and then you can have that kind of information. So, my second to the last question for you is personally, as a journalist reporting on this subject, so what is next for you in your career, and what kinds of support do you get beyond what your media organization provides, and what do you think ideally should be in place to make reporting this issue to be much easier for you to do?
Yeah. So, I mean, after gun violence, that's something I've been trying to think about. It's hard because it's like there's so much happening, and I don't, it's hard to think that far in advance of like when I might be done with this topic. But I would probably want to focus on like race and equity, and, how disparities in like housing and health manifest, where they come from. I would also love to do like fun stories about like reality TV and musicians and gossip and all kind of frivolous stuff once in a while. It's nice to cleanse the palate with that. I will say my newsroom is incredibly helpful and supportive when it comes to this topic. If I do, the one time I had to cover a mass shooting, a worker at a light rail system in San Jose, California, came in and killed a number of his colleagues. And I had to go and like cover it that day. And it was not my favorite experience. It was very sad and traumatic. And the next day, my bosses were like, you should take the day off. It wasn't even a question of like, oh, well, if you feel like you can make it through the day, stay on. They're like, nah, take a day off, refuel, get yourself together. And I think the approach that my job has taken, that like, obviously they're not here for charity. They're editors. And if they want you to do something, like, you're gonna have to do it. But they also recognize that this topic is incredibly difficult. and they always make it clear that I should and need to take time off, because if I am all stressed out and crying trying to write, like, they're not going to get their stuff on time. So I think they've taken a really helpful approach that I didn't realize wasn't as common, which was to say, like, take, after you do an interview with a family member, take a half a day off or something. I've been in an upcoming week, I've been doing a lot of gun violence stories, obviously, and my editor was just like, maybe take a couple days to reach out to like freelancers or to find other people, talk to organizations, just something to break it up. And to have that come, as a reporter, you may not necessarily take that on for yourself. Like, you might not decide like, oh yeah, I'm going to take this time off, or I'm going to stagger my workday like this, because you want to do well, right? You want to show up and be the best at your job. But to have it kind of be forcefully suggested by an editor that you need to take a moment and stagger some of these interviews is really it's really motivating and helpful to see. It makes me feel like this beat is more sustainable than I had originally thought. I thought I would just do this for maybe 2 or 3 years and burn out because it's too much and move on to something else. But I also, now seeing how there are practices you can put in place to make this job a little less intense, or make the trauma last a little shorter amount of time, then it's that's possible. So I know I want to cover more like race and equity stuff next. Frivolous things, absolutely. Like, send me to the first hotel in friggin' like Las Vegas where you can be in a room with turtles. Like, yeah, send me to that very ridiculous story and I would like to do it. So that's something that I'm looking forward to in my future. But otherwise, like, just having the support of my bosses and always feeling like if I need to take a day, I'm not going to be like punished or looked down on for it, is something that I hope every reporter gets to experience.
Yeah, I was one of my questions for you was how do you keep your mental health in check? And I think um, that's an important aspect that you mentioned, and the fact that you're also trying to try your hands on other topics of interest. That is also really, really
Yes.
equally important. Do you think there can
Yeah.
come a day can come that journalists, is it possible to run out of story ideas to report on gun violence?
No, no, even if you're not, I mean, there's always victim stories, you know what I'm saying? There are always people who are like, I don't know what happened to my loved one who was killed X number of years ago, and we talk about like true crime and this sort of genre of mainly podcasts and limited series on television. And there are people who live that every day, you know what I'm saying? Knowing, they go outside one day or they hear gunshots outside of their house, they come out and their kid is dead, just sitting in a car, and they never find out what's happening. And their last memory is just that their child is, laying in a pool of their own blood. And those sort of things, I think, are always going to be worth telling. Those sort of stories are unique, even though it's unfortunately happened to many people, it's always something that is worth talking about. And unfortunately, gun violence is something that will likely continue to happen in the US, and people will always need to report on it. People are always going to be trying to do things new and innovative in their communities to heal people and to keep kids safe, and I think that's always going to be worth reporting on as well. So no, not really. Like, there's always going to be something, and you're always going to come across something that, a news item that makes you be like, interesting. So, not unfortunately, there is no shortage of stories on this beat. If it
Yeah,
needs to be, there's too many, and thankfully we have more freelancers now. So,
another question I have for you is on what is your recommendation when journalists are talking to families or individuals that have been directly affected by gun violence? Are there peculiar
yeah,
suggestions regarding teaching them?
I mean, I think you really need to be more human in these situations. I think there's a tendency for reporters to um, be almost pushy in a way. Like, it's tough because if you're on a deadline and you need this person to get back to you, like, it's very stressful. But I have always tried to remember that what I have going on in this story is not the center of this person, and they might take a minute to get back to me, and they might take longer than a government official or something like that. And I think when approaching people, letting them know like exactly what your story is, and having something that you're probably going to write about. Like, I wouldn't just reach out to, well, maybe now because this is like the beat that I've developed, but early on, or if this wasn't my specific beat, like, I don't know that I would just reach out to a family member of someone who I saw, was killed or something like that, just to like kind of talk to them about it without a story coming out. You know what I mean? Like, you just want to be mindful of any calls that will, trigger something in them that, you're not going to be there to console them. So if you don't have a story that's running, I might not just kind of talk to a gun violence survivor unless it's somebody who is very public with what has happened to them, is trying to motivate others to, pursue healing, then maybe. But I, would be very careful and judicious about when you reach out to folks. I think being in touch with families if you are interviewing somebody, make sure as much of the interview as possible focuses on who the person was and what their experience was, and who the person who was killed was. And in addition to that, asking the victim's family about how they experienced, the day their loved one was killed, and just keeping it not so focused on like, okay, what are the kind of gritty details and the kind of sad, traumatizing moments, because you can get that from a police report, and obviously it's sad. You know what I'm saying? Like, you don't need to necessarily put someone's parent through the agony of being like, yeah, they were shot and this horrible thing happened to them, and their blood did this, and I came in and there were these spatters everywhere. If they want to tell you that, sure. But I think there's a way to ask those questions that keeps the focus on the living person's experience, and also makes it clear that you care about who their loved one was before they passed away. Because all that the other details are gonna come. There's always the moment that you're gonna have to ask, okay, well, how did you, a better way of being like, okay, what happened to your loved one is saying, well, how did you find out? What was your experience like that day, instead of being like, what were they doing? Because it's hard, you envision your person, you start to kind of feel the pain and the kind of fear that they may have gone through in the last moments of their lives. You just don't want to bring that kind of stuff up in people, unnecessarily, especially. They got to live with it every day. So I think just being very mindful of the fact that, like, we're reporters, we want the juice, we want to know what's going on in as much detail as possible. Like, you might, on this beat, like, you might not get that from somebody. You know what I'm saying? Like, you might have to, or it might take a couple calls, a couple conversations, and some trust building before they'll tell you, at some of the more kind of sad details. So, it's just all about really being human. If the person cries, like I've cried on the phone because this is really sad, and it's okay to do that, and I think that after you do a story on somebody, if you see something happening with their loved one in the news, if somebody is arrested and it goes to trial, that's another very kind of traumatizing situation for people. So sending a text that says, hey, I saw that the trial was happening, don't want to interview, don't want nothing, just want to let you know I saw that, and I'm thinking about you. And I think that's a completely okay and ethical thing to do as a reporter, especially, when you're asking people about like the worst thing that's ever happened to them.
Yes, thank you very much. So we have a comment and from Maxwell Sud, who's joining us from Ghana. It goes thus: in the case of Ghana, legal guns are in the hands of people, and that is increasing gun violence in some communities. The government attempt to persuade people to hand over the guns has since failed. Just a comment. So thank you very much for that comment. And so one of the things that I think is really, really obvious is that this issue is not just this is not something that is peculiar to the United States alone. If you look closely enough in your country, there are always avenues to talk about gun violence, to talk about gun issues, and putting, like she rightly said, putting the victim at the center, focusing on the victims can actually enable you to write better stories. And there is also the human angle, which you mentioned, in addition to the various story ideas. So as we wrap up, so what do you think? What are your concluding remarks, and what key message do you think is important for journalists in the U.S. and elsewhere to know about this subject? And yes, so
Yeah. I think there's a really positive growing recognition that the majority of gun violence isn't mass shootings or isn't high profile mass shootings. Mass shootings happen in communities every day where 4 people are hit by, a single gun person. So I think there's been more of a broad or growing, I wouldn't say it's as broad as the issue is, but there's a growing acknowledgement in the US that most people who die from gun violence aren't dying in the situations that we see, in Connecticut with Sandy Hook, or even in El Paso, which the anniversary of that was just yesterday, the 3-year anniversary of the El Paso mass shooting. Most people aren't dying in those situations, but the pain and the trauma that comes with being shot and surviving, or being shot, or having your loved one shot and killed, is something that so many people experience. And I think just knowing that is putting you a little ahead of the game in a lot of areas, which is kind of, it feels kind of bleak to say, but just having that acknowledgement and knowing and being able to tell your reporter, or tell your editors after a mass shooting that, like, hey, I'd like to focus on this community and really localize the story, is something that we still don't see often. It's still kind of a growing thing in especially US journalism. So I think that focusing on those people will lead you to so many excellent stories, investigations, and all type of stuff when you look beyond high profile mass shootings. And that's really just something I like to always emphasize to reporters that I speak to.
so thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate
Yes.
your contributions. We appreciate your time. Like I said at the outset of this session, this is not a topic that we can exhaust in a discussion or in a session. And please and please try as much as possible to even get more information. Use some of the tools that she has suggested. Explore some of the story ideas that she has also given. And whenever you're writing anything on this subject, especially within this period, and that you would like us to that you would like to enter in our story contest, please and please do not hesitate to reach out. I'm striving to make it as easy as possible for you to enter and win. So there are two ways for you to participate in the story contest. The first aspect is in you being our newsletter subscriber. If you're a newsletter subscriber, and you can easily reply to that newsletter that you receive in your email with your entry. Or if you are part of our Facebook community, which I will encourage you to do, if you go to Facebook and you search for this forum, I think I should get the link right away so that you can just click the link and be part of what we do here. So if you go to Facebook and you just join our Facebook forum page, you can easily get your entries across, and we are going to really consider it as for the month. So like I said, we have a cash prize every month for these projects, and this can easily be yours if you enter your submission on time. So the focus on this month would include gun violence. So if you are writing any story that is related to gun violence, please and please let us be aware of it so that we can enter it for this month's competition. So thank you very much, Abené, for your contributions today. I'm really personally impressed with your reportage. It's really important to ensure that we actually focus on those issues that you are focusing on, gender issues and racial issues, as they affect as it affects gun violence reporting. And irrespective of where you are, these issues are also of relevance to your audience. And to know more about this forum and what we do, don't hesitate to visit the ICFJ's website, the International Center for Journalists website, on www.icfj.org. And there are also several resources, including on gun violence reporting and other subjects on IGNet's website on www.ignet.org. So on behalf of my entire team, including Stella, who's at the back end, ensuring things work smoothly, I want to thank you very much, including our participants that are joining us in different parts of the world. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll discuss another exciting topic. Abené, I wish you good luck in all your endeavors. And anytime we are trying, one of the comments that we had, somebody gave us was the request for certificates. Unfortunately, this is not a certificate session. We are not getting a certificate for this session, but somewhere on the down line when we decide to put a multi-week training together that you can obtain certificates we'll endeavor to get it across to you. So thank you very much for attending this session, and enjoy the rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.